Hey everyone, Nick Green here, and today we're going to talk about analysis. So now I wanted to first talk about analysis because it's the key to many of the things that I've been discussing on previous episodes when it comes to functions of behavior, when it comes to looking at what labels we're using. Really, when it comes down to it, we're all at some degree analyzing our behavior to some extent, and really, this is the magic of applied behavior analysis, right? It's in the name, right? It's the third part of it. So analyzing behavior is super important, and how well we do it is really going to determine how successful our fitness programs are. So really this episode is called, Analysis 101. Again, this is a video version. If you're listening to the podcast, I'll be doing a lot of writing on the iPad, so I think it'll be fun little breakdown here. So here we go. So now when we talk about analysis, I think, there's kind of 5 buckets when we talk about what we're going to be doing when it comes to making these decisions. So first bucket, I think let me get my black pen here. First bucket, what we're going to talk about is we're talking about behavior, right? We're talking about those observable actions in the environment. So we're talking about behavior. We'll talk a little bit about XY graphing. We're going to talk about, what our current baseline is. We're going to talk about the weighting game. And then at the end, we're going to talk about evaluating change. Okay, so those are going to be kind of our 5 talking points here. So we're going to look at behavior, XY graphing, baseline, our quote baseline, the weighting game, and evaluating change. So now, when it comes to behavior, what I found is that, first of all, there's many things we can be measuring, right? We need something that's observable, measurable, repeatable. Really, when it comes down to it, there's only, I found that really only 2 to 3 things that we can really, target at any given time. So I think focusing on 2 to 3 targets is the way to go, because once you get into more targets, it's really hard to keep up with that, right? Again, so we're talking about analysis here, data analysis. We're analyzing a program. So if we are spending, it's that balance of, how much time we're spending on data collection, and then how much time we're actually, analyzing what's happening. So that's kind of the world we live in now. So I'll touch on that briefly. So really, I've kind of found that 2 to 3 target range is key to really having a good balance of, okay, we're going to measure some things, implement a change, see what happens, go back and measure it again. So, I didn't come up with this quote, but it's something that goes like this. It's that you can learn more, and this comes from behavior analysis. You can come more from measuring one thing many times versus many things one time. So if we pick one target, if we measure how much weight I'm lifting on the back squat, if we measure how many miles I'm running, per day, those are easy to measure. One target, one movement, one modality. You can measure those things repeatable every day versus I'm going to measure jumping jack sit-ups, Olympic snatch, measure, how many times I went to judo class, and the next day I'm going to measure, again, if this is just one person, then I'll measure body fat, weight, nutrition, running time. So measuring many things doesn't allow us, this analysis, which we'll get to later. So I've just found that 2 to 3 targets, so just measuring those things, in this case, I'd say 2 to 3 targets, many times is the key, right? We learn more about an individual learner if we can see how they change over time. And this is the difficult part, right? I'm talking about an individual level analysis versus a group analysis. So also when it comes to behavior, we need to be concerned with, how do we get the data? Is it one of 2 things here? Is it number 1, how valid is it? And number 2, how reliable is it? So these are, gets into the technical research side of things, but valid is it measuring what it's supposed to? If I put on the Fitbit, if I put on the Apple Watch, if I put the weight on the barbell and it says 45-pound plate, is that right? If I step onto the scale and it measures my weight, is that right? It gives me a number. is it measuring what it's supposed to? What it's supposed to, right? Then reliability, does it? Reliability, again, the extent to which that measurement, is the same and consistent. So the consistency of measurement. And this is easy to think about. I'm just writing here. The consistency of the measurement. So step on the scale, it is, you weigh 180 pounds, and then you step on it again, it's 185 pounds. You step on it again, it's 181 pounds. Not very reliable. So you might need to look at, okay, what's happening? There's a piece of cardboard or something underneath it, or your scale's on on a hill or something, and you're just not standing on it the same way every time. So you want to do it everything reliable. So working our way through the behavior here. So we need 2 to 3 targets, right? We need to have really good data. And then it comes down to funneling again to the analysis. So just on this first part, we need to look at how we're going to collect those data. How are we going to collect? Our collection method. One of 2 ways. Most popular, direct observation. We're humans, we got eyeballs. It's easy to see each other, so we have direct observation. Or number 2, depending on what the goals are, we have all these fancy gadgets and gizmos. So this is where all the wearables come in. I've written many blogs about, Fitbits and activity watches. Recently on a podcast with Matt Sikoria, I talked about the Zoom band, and that, they have fancy algorithms to track, this strain or recovery measure, sleep analyses, things like that. So we have the tools out there, and they're just collecting amazing data, and it's just a matter of, if we consider it like a funnel, we're collecting all this data, and what are we going to do with it? And that's where that's what this podcast is about. So we have data collection here. We either have like direct observation, or we have, the gadgets and gizmos. So again, just on the behavior piece, we want to measure 2 to 3 targets. We want to make sure those data are valid and reliable, measuring what they're supposed to, right? Here's a good example with validity. So I always make the joke of, you can get steps by taking 12-ounce curls at the bar, right? So it's not a valid measure if you're, taking 20 steps and those are actually 20 sips of, beer or a shot or whatever it is. Data also need to be reliable, and then we collect those either through direct observation or through gadgets. So that is a lot of front-end work just to get to the measurement piece, and we haven't even touched the analysis part yet. So now, that was the first part was behavior. Now the second part, we're going to look at the XY graphing. So here, all right. So this is kind of what sets behavior analysts apart. Behavior analysts apart like myself. So we don't use group designs. We kind of rely on this single case analysis. It's kind of a practical way to look at your data. So if we have the y-axis here, again, better viewed on YouTube here, you have the y-axis. We've all seen these before, right? We learned this in geometry class. We learned this is the quadrant 1 of the Cartesian coordinate plane, right? So we have the x and y axis, right? So we kind of make our living up here in quadrant 1 if you are a math head like I am. So XY graphing, what we need to do then is we're selecting some target, right? The target, let's say it's, we could just say miles run per week, right? That's going to be on the y-axis, miles here. Then you have on the x, you're going to put some type of time measure usually. So time, this is going to be in weeks. So then you can have week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, 5, 6, and so on. So what you do is, let's just put a number up there of 20 miles per week, and then we just start taking the data, right? So we look at here, say week 1, we have 5 miles, week 2, we got 6 or 10, whatever it is, and maybe week 3, we're going down. So we just stop here, and we'll come back to this chart later, but again, we want to take those behaviors that we measured on the gadgets and put it on an XY graph. And most apps nowadays have that, but have this feature of graphing your data on an XY plane, or they sometimes slap it in a table and say, your average was this week and it was up or down since last week. But visually here, it's important to look at actually seeing what is happening when it comes to looking at that graph. So, and your performance. So, this sets up, the next phase. Really what we can start adding here is now determining, phase 3, determining that baseline. I'm going to put that baseline here in air quotes. So baseline here. So this is, sometimes in research terms, we think about baseline as, nothing's really happened, but this is the real world here. This is kind of your working baseline. You're going to have a long history of working out and running or exercising and engaging in some fitness program. That's just what it is. So, in this case here, if we look at this graph, we'll say the average here is, say that's about 10 miles per week. That's going to be your baseline here. And all we do is we kind of separate it with this magic line, right? We'll say, everything to the left of the line, weeks 1 through 3, that's your baseline phase. And the magic here is what changed this blue line. This, again, between weeks 3 and 4, that's going to be your intervention. And this is easy to understand. Everything to the left of the line, baseline, real world, what happened. Everything to the right of the line is going to be what you did, what you changed, what we're going to analyze in the long term. What we're going to focus on as far as making decisions as it relates to, is this next intervention meeting our goals, right? So let's just make up an intervention here. Let's say maybe a key component here, a key ingredient. Let's say in baseline, we have running solo, running by yourself. And let's say the intervention now, let's say you found a running buddy. For argument's sake here, let's say that person, ran at the same pace as you. What might happen is if you keep taking the same data again, getting back to that valid and reliable, those gadgets, not changing anything now, sticking with those same measures, very important, right? Measuring that one thing, even though now you're running with a friend. Now let's say, okay, week 4, maybe 15 miles, week 5, 14 miles, week 6, 12 miles. We connect those dots. And we see, just through a quick little analysis, let's say now your average here visually doesn't line up on the page, but let's just say it's at 15 miles, right? We see, as a function now, we're already getting, ahead to step 5 here when we're evaluating change. We're looking at, oh, wow, my baseline, 10 miles a week. Intervention with a running buddy, that was the only change that we are confident in saying that, that was the difference. Up 5 miles per week. And we know, working out with friends, social reinforcers, we talked about that 2 episodes ago. Those environmental events may extend the run a little bit longer. Maybe they can push you through that run. They can maybe, these were weekly data, so we could say that maybe that person said, let's go out on an extra run per week. Those things would be interesting to look at. So we're looking at again, that piece that we're measuring here. We're thinking about what changed. Oop, that is a big point there. Okay, so we got what changed, right? And then we think about to what extent. In this case, our weekly miles changed, and to what extent? On average, 5 miles a week. Okay, so that sets up determining that baseline, determining what's happening in our programs. Now, moving on to step 4, we begin to look at, okay, now we have to play the waiting game. And the waiting game is really kind of like what that microscope is. What's our patience with everything, so to speak? The waiting game, are we looking at the short term versus the long term? So in my example up here, I looked at, okay, a 6-week window, hypothetically. Now we want to look at, let's say, if we draw a new kind of XY graph, and now we put months, on the x-axis, and we put miles again. On the y-axis, we put January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Let's say those weeks there, on average, let's say we're at 25, right? And let's say we have a goal race, let's say at the end of the year, we have a goal race of here. Our goal is to run, let's just say a marathon. And we know that goal race is going to be a 26-mile run. So we think about in the short term, like what what benchmarks do we need to hit in the short term if we're approaching those targets, right? And that's what, there's many running programs out there. I'm not a running program expert, but what I am an expert in is at evaluating how well our programs are predicting, if we're going to reach our goals or not. So, again, this is that decision that comes down to the individual person, the individual athlete, the individual coach to decide, okay, we're looking at data this way, we're looking at the analysis, we're looking at this valid and reliable data. Okay, how do those new data points map on to those goals, and how do they predict, right? We may see over, maybe a couple months before, we might be trending in the wrong direction. Those weekly miles could be going down, and that's something that happened with a previous client. We had to look at those metrics. It took a long time to determine, but how do we make sure that those data points, those weekly miles, then hit the direction, start trending towards the area we want to go to. And so that's what, a key feature then of, if we have a long-term goal, analyzing if our current programming is helping us predict whether or not we are going to, reach that goal. And that's something that's incredibly important when it comes to, I've talked to many athletes over the years that, oftentimes people hit walls. Really comes down to, there's nothing in the immediate environment. There's no system to really help that person, remain confident, loosely speaking, to say, you know what, this program's working, and we have, here's the data. I can show you those programming decisions. I can show you that the targets that we're working on are going in the right direction, because the worst thing is that you want to have somebody just go out there and say, I've been doing this program for 3 to 6 months, 3 to 6 weeks. I have no clue if it's working or not. And then that's where that decision of if, what's the goal? Is it that short-term piece, long-term piece? I'm around many amateur athletes in the CrossFit space, and people are very hard workers. They have many skills. There's many things to work on. It can be sometimes very overwhelming and confusing, sometimes very frustrating, and maybe aligning some of these goals, these, kind of these strategies here with data collection and plopping things in an XY chart can alleviate some of that frustration. So the waiting game, step 4, last step here, step 5, we're looking at evaluating the change. Now, this is the essentials. This is, again, I touched on it earlier, looking at how often you're collecting data, how much data you're collecting, right? If I'm a process guy, so think about how much you're putting into the system and how much you can get out of the system. If all we're putting in the system is data, we're not spending any time analyzing it, then we're not making any conclusions, we're not making any decisions. So sometimes we get crippled by the amount of data that we're collecting. We get crippled by the amount of decisions we have to make. Sometimes we have decision paralysis, right? We can never make a decision. We don't know what to do. So it's hard. It's difficult. So it's always kind of that sweet science, if you will. That's more boxing. That's more my advisor, Paulie Glove's channeling through me. It's more of like the art and the science of, analyzing behavior. So evaluating the change. So for me as a behavior analyst, like I mentioned in previous episodes, I want to look at, what's happening in the environment, right? In our running example earlier, we looked at, okay, we had the addition of one running buddy, right? I mean, there always could be something as simple or straightforward as that. Okay, running buddy. For me recently, I moved across the country, right? What happened? I moved across the country. I changed, work locations. And as a function of those variables coming together, what did I see? I saw a decrease in step counts and overall exercise minutes, right? Evaluating the change. And I had the data to look at it, right? So I had that my step data, I always wore the Apple Watch. Again, I'm not just making up labels. Oh, I just got lazy all of a sudden. I said, no, let's look at those variables. Let's look at those data that I've been collecting for the past several years now, because I've had a watch for a couple of years. Let's look at what changes in the environment and see if I can find anything there. And usually, when that's the case, when you look into the environment, there's something to look at. So, looking at those environmental changes, running buddy in the example below, I moved across the country, something as simple as, man, you could look at some type of, it could be like a medical injury. So you have some type of, medical reason, right? You could have, somebody rolls an ankle, somebody has a shoulder tweak, somebody, you get setbacks with a low back injury if you, rounded your back during a deadlift. So I think we've all, those of us who have deadlifted, we all know when you push the envelope a little bit, you might pull a little hard or a little early, you lose some form, and that's how you learn, which is okay. That's learning by contingencies. Learning not to push it when your back is lit up, but those simple medical reasons could push your back. That's an easy one to understand. So we're looking at the changes in our programming as they relate to functional changes in the environment. So now that kind of leads to looking at these changes. So now our decisions, now these evaluations, this is not guesswork. We're not just making things up. We're looking closely at what is happening in the environment. So it's not guesswork, right? We're not looking at hypothetical constructs. Again, that was the labels episode last week, so go back and listen to that if you haven't. So you have the hypothetical constructs, right? It's not just lazy, vain, unmotivated, right? It's not, I have the case of the what's, I got a case of the Mondays. No, let's look at what's happening. I worked a 10-hour day. I'm out of energy, right, so to speak. Things like that. So evaluating the change, plopping that on the chart for it to move back up here. Move back to the initial running buddy chart here. This isn't just, maybe I just, it's just like, I was just sad this day or something, or I don't know. Let's look at what's happening here. It wasn't so much you're sad. It was, there's a running buddy that showed up, right? So we're looking at, those environmental changes. And again, we're looking at research. Not again, but I'm bringing this up the first time many times when we talk about understanding the environmental changes is that correlation does not equal causation. So just because two things move along together does not mean that they, one causes, A causes B or B causes A, right? So if we look at kind of the XY chart again, what we want to see, this is the real world, not research here. So we have kind of that baseline, and then say we have our running buddy. We move up here. The weekly miles increase, and then let's say the running buddy goes away, and then miles go down, and then the running buddy comes back, and the miles go back up. So now when we pop in our lines here, we say nobody, nobody, no running buddy, with buddy, phase 2. So we got phase 1, nobody, no running buddy, phase 2, with a running buddy, and then phase 3, none, and then with a buddy, phase 4. So now when we have these distinct phases, we can say, we know that when we have a buddy, right, this likely caused the running change, right? So this gets into the kind of the basics of analyzing data when it comes on an XY graph, on a single case design, repeated measures design, N of 1 design, whatever you want to call it. We begin looking at what was the functional relation, what changed in the environment. In this case, the running minutes, these running miles changed as a function of the social reinforcer that seemed to be available, which was that running buddy. So when we're evaluating the change again, just to review, we're going to look at the environment, what we're measuring. We're not just guessing. We're not just saying, this is correlated. It might be difficult to find the actual relations there, but at the end of the day, we want to make a sound conclusion of what's happening. So again, just to review, I'll list them off here on the iPad. When it comes down to making this, analysis of fitness behavior, we need to know what the behavior is, just a couple targets. We need to plop it down on an XY graph. We need to determine what our current baseline is, and we need to play the waiting game. Really, it's about adjusting our macroscope when we're playing the short game, which is fine. Separate goals, different strategies for that. Or are we playing the long-term game, right? Is it Is it something that is just going to take a significant amount of planning? And then to put all that together, that's the evaluation time, right? That is the time that we need to spend on, okay, we have the data, we analyzed it in a certain way, we figured out where we were, what our baseline was, we looked at what happened at significant points in our program, and then we make then we analyze it, right? That's the analysis part of applied behavior analysis. We're taking all these data together, and this takes a long time to put together. It doesn't happen overnight. So we make this judgment. We decide it program's working, or we decide nope, we need to make a change. And this is all based on what the athlete wants to do. So that wraps it up for the Analysis 101 episode. So again, comment, share, you know what to do when it comes out there to social media. So I hope you enjoyed. Keep moving, and I'll see you soon.